Welcome to Life Stories, where the extraordinary journeys of ordinary people inspire us all. In today's story, we uncover a tale of resilience, courage, and justice as we follow Officer James Miller and an elderly woman, Helen Carter, whose whispered words spark an investigation that unravels decades of corruption. What begins as a quiet morning in Maplewood turns into a race against time to protect Helen and expose the dangerous secrets hidden in her past. Subscribe now to Life Stories and join us as we dive into today's compelling story of bravery and redemption. Let's begin. It was a crisp morning in Maplewood, the kind where the sunlight draped gently over the manicured lawns and cast a warm glow on the tree-lined streets. This peaceful suburb had always been a picture of tranquility, where neighbors greeted one another over white picket fences, and the most pressing concern often revolved around misplaced mail or barking dogs. As I drove through those familiar streets in my patrol car, I couldn't shake the sense of calm that always came with my morning rounds. Maplewood felt timeless, safe, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But on that day, something changed. As I turned into Elmwood Court, the cul-de-sac at the edge of my route, my attention caught on an elderly woman standing on her front porch. Helen Carter was a name I knew well. She'd lived in that house for longer than I'd been alive. Quiet and dignified, she kept mostly to herself, though her presence was a comforting constant in the neighborhood. But this morning, something was wrong. She looked frail, her slight frame hunched as she clutched the wooden railing for support. Her silver hair, usually neat and elegant, was disheveled, and her cardigan hung awkwardly off one shoulder. Her steps were uneven, her movements sluggish, as if she were caught in some unseen struggle. My heart leapt in concern, and I pulled the car to a stop, stepping out and calling to her, "Mrs. Carter, are you all right?" My voice was calm, but firm. She didn't answer. Her lips moved soundlessly, her gaze distant and unfocused. She took another unsteady step, and then her knees buckled. I reached her just in time, kneeling beside her as she collapsed onto the sidewalk. "Helen." I shook her shoulder gently, trying to rouse her. Her eyelids fluttered open briefly, and she fixed me with a gaze that sent a chill through my spine. Her hand, frail but insistent, clutched my sleeve with surprising strength. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words were unforgettable. "They'll find me." I froze. My mind raced with questions. Who? Why? What was she so afraid of? Before I could press her further, her eyes rolled back, and her hand fell limp, checking her pulse. I found it faint but steady. I grabbed my radio. "Dispatch. This is Officer Miller. I need an ambulance at 147, Elmwood Court." Elderly female. Collapsed and unresponsive. As I waited for help to arrive, my attention was drawn to something in her hand. She had a crumpled piece of paper clutched tightly in her fingers. Gently prying it loose, I unfolded it, and my brow furrowed as I read the hurried scrawl, "If anything happens to me, the answers are in the box." The ambulance's sirens wailed in the distance as I stared at those words. What box? What answers? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Helen Carter was afraid of was far bigger than just a simple medical emergency. The paramedics arrived quickly, their movements efficient as they stabilized her frail body and loaded her onto the stretcher. "Will she be okay?" I asked one of them, my concern evident in my tone. "Her pulse is weak, but she's stable for now," the paramedic replied. "You should notify her next of kin, if possible." I stood there on the sidewalk, watching the ambulance disappear down the street, the sound of the sirens growing faint. Something about the way she'd looked at me, the fear in her eyes, and those cryptic words, "They'll find me," left me shaken. Helen Carter wasn't the kind of person to exaggerate or dramatize. She was known for her quiet dignity, her solitude. And yet, the note she'd written suggested something far more sinister. I walked up the steps to her front door, noticing that it was slightly ajar. As a patrol officer, I had a duty to secure the property, especially given the circumstances of her collapse. Pushing the door open, I announced my presence. Maplewood PD. Is anyone here? Silence greeted me, save for the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath my boots. The house was immaculate. Almost unnaturally so. It felt more like a museum exhibit than a home. Framed photographs lined the walls. Snapshots of decades gone by, birthdays, graduations, holidays. They spoke of a life filled with memories. But there was an air of stillness about the place that unsettled me. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if untouched by the passage of years. Then, my gaze landed on the coffee table in the center of the room. A polished wooden box sat there, locked with a sturdy padlock. It was the only thing out of place in an otherwise pristine room. My pulse quickened as I crouched beside it, running my fingers over the smooth surface. Was this the box Helen's note had referred to? What answers could it hold? And why did she feel the need to leave such a cryptic message? Before I could contemplate further, there was a soft knock on the doorframe behind me. I turned to see Clara Thompson, Helen's neighbor, standing hesitantly with a laundry basket in hand. "Officer Miller," she said softly. "I saw the ambulance. Is Helen all right?" "She's stable. But she's been taken to the hospital," I replied, rising to meet her. "I'm just making sure her home is secure." Clara's expression clouded with concern. "She's been acting so strange lately," she murmured, shifting the basket in her arms. "I thought it was just old age. But now I don't know." "What do you mean by strange?" I prompted gently. Clara hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the box on the table before returning to me. "She kept saying someone was watching her," she said. "She even installed new locks on the doors last week. At night, I'd see her checking the windows over and over. I told her she was imagining things. But she seemed so convinced." I felt the weight of Clara's words settle over me like a heavy cloud. Something was deeply wrong here, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that Helen Carter's fears weren't just the figments of an aging mind. Whatever she was afraid of was very real, and it was only the beginning. I couldn't shake the unease as I stood in Helen Carter's living room, staring at the polished box resting on the coffee table. Clara Thompson had left, her parting words lingering in my mind. She thought someone was watching her. I glanced at the box again, the weight of the mystery settling on my shoulders. Whatever was happening, it had pushed Helen to the brink. And now she was fighting for her life in the hospital. I was determined to figure out why. Carefully, I picked up the box. It was heavier than I'd expected, its weight symbolic of the secrets it seemed to guard. The sturdy padlock was a clear message: this wasn't meant to be opened easily. I scanned the room one last time, noting how every item seemed to be in its rightful place, as if Helen had meticulously prepared for something. The silence in the house felt oppressive, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Placing the box securely in the trunk of my car, I couldn't ignore the charged atmosphere of the neighborhood. Maplewood's quiet streets now felt watchful, as though something unseen lurked just out of sight. I radioed Detective Linda Hayes, my partner, as I climbed into the driver's seat. Linda was the kind of investigator who saw patterns where others saw chaos, a knack that made her invaluable in unraveling cases like this. "Linda, it's James. I've got something unusual," I began, keeping my voice steady despite the gnawing uncertainty. "I'm bringing it to the precinct, a locked box and a cryptic note. Helen Carter collapsed this morning, and something doesn't sit right about it." Her response was immediate. "Bring it in. I'll pull her file and meet you in my office." Sounds like we've got a puzzle on our hands. The drive to the precinct was uneventful, but my mind churned. Helen's whispered words echoed in my thoughts: "They'll find me." I couldn't escape the feeling that time was slipping away, that whatever Helen feared was closing in. By the time I arrived and walked into Linda's office, she already had a file open and a notepad filled with her neat, precise handwriting. Linda's sharp eyes flicked to the box as I placed it on her desk. So, this is it, she said. Her tone curious but cautious. Any idea what's inside? I shook my head. No, but Helen had it front and center in her living room. She wrote a note saying, "If anything happens to me, the answers are in the box." She wouldn't have left that lightly. Linda nodded, pulling a set of lock-picking tools from her drawer. "Let's see what we're dealing with." It took her a few tense minutes. But finally, the padlock clicked open. She lifted the lid carefully, and the contents inside immediately demanded attention. Yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and a leather-bound journal filled the box. Linda and I exchanged a glance, both sensing the gravity of what we'd found. She picked up one of the photographs first, a black and white image of a much younger Helen, standing beside a distinguished man in a suit. Scribbled on the back were the words, "Helen and Henry Carter, 1967, that must be her husband." Linda murmured, flipping through the clippings. Henry Carter's name appeared again and again, tied to reports of embezzlement, fraud, and a mysterious disappearance in 1981. He had owned multiple companies in construction and real estate, but his empire had collapsed under the weight of scandal. The journal, written in Helen's careful script, detailed decades of pain, betrayal, and fear. "This isn't just a story about embezzlement," Linda said, her voice tight as she read aloud an entry dated a few months ago. "I can't stop thinking about what I found. It wasn't an accident. If I don't speak up, it will stay buried forever. But if I do..." She paused, her brows furrowed. "James." She stumbled onto something big. I turned the pages of the journal carefully, each entry painting a clearer picture of Helen's torment. Her once-beloved husband had betrayed not just her, but countless others. She had stayed silent for years. But the journal revealed a growing fear that she might be the next victim of the same forces that had destroyed Henry. Before we could delve deeper, Linda's phone buzzed. It was the hospital. "Helen's condition is critical," the nurse informed her. "We've found traces of poison, something that's been administered over time." I felt a chill run through me. Poison wasn't an accident. Someone had targeted Helen, and the implications were horrifying. I clenched my fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Linda, this isn't just about uncovering the past. Someone is trying to silence her." She nodded, already flipping through the journal again. "We need to act fast. If she wakes up, we might get more answers. But for now, let's start with the obvious. Who benefits from keeping Helen quiet?" The air in Linda's office felt charged as we stood over the box, its secrets finally coming to light. We didn't yet have all the answers. But one thing was clear: Helen Carter's fears weren't imagined. They were real. And they were deadly. Helen Carter's hospital room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The soft hum of the machines filled the air as Detective Linda Hayes and I stood beside her frail form. Her pale face seemed even smaller beneath the oxygen mask. And the sight of her like this twisted something deep inside me. How had her life come to this? Alone in a hospital bed, clutching secrets that had nearly cost her everything. "Mrs. Carter," I said softly, leaning closer. "It's Officer Miller. You're safe now." Her eyelids fluttered weakly, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't respond. But then her hand twitched. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. The strength in her grip was gone, replaced by a trembling fragility. Yet, her determination was unmistakable. "The box," she murmured, her voice barely audible beneath the mask. "It's all in the box." Linda stepped forward, notepad in hand. "Helen," she said gently, "can you tell us who's trying to hurt you? Who would want to keep you quiet?" Helen's lips parted, but her words dissolved into a coughing fit. The nurse moved quickly to adjust her oxygen mask, her expression firm but kind. "She needs rest," the nurse said, giving us a pointed look. "You can try again later." Linda and I exchanged a glance. Later. The word felt like a fragile promise. One that might not hold up under the weight of Helen's condition. As we left the room, I couldn't help but glance back at her. Even in her vulnerability, there was something resilient about her, an inner strength that had kept her going all these years. Back at the precinct, the weight of Helen's words pressed down on us. The box now sat open on Linda's desk, its contents meticulously organized but still brimming with unanswered questions. The journal had revealed much about her life with Henry Carter, his charm, his ambition, and the darker truths that had unraveled their marriage. But one entry stood out among the rest. Dated just weeks before her collapse, "The truth is buried where love never dies." "James, what do you think she meant?" Linda asked, tapping her pen against the desk. "It sounds poetic. But Helen wouldn't waste time being cryptic if it wasn't important." I frowned, leaning over the journal. It could be symbolic or literal. What if she's talking about Henry's grave? Linda's eyes lit up with realization. It makes sense. If she suspected foul play in his disappearance, she might have hidden something there, somewhere no one would think to look. It wasn't easy convincing the city to approve an exhumation, but Helen's critical condition and the evidence in the journal made a compelling case. By mid-afternoon, we found ourselves standing in the quiet expanse of Maplewood Cemetery. The chill in the air seemed sharper, and the stillness of the graveyard pressed against my skin. The headstone marking Henry Carter's grave was ornate, etched with words that now seemed bitterly ironic: "Beloved husband and visionary." The examination team worked methodically, removing the soil as Linda and I watched in tense silence. Every instinct I had told me we were close to something big. Moments later, the sound of metal scraping against metal broke the stillness. A rusted box emerged from beneath the headstone, its edges corroded with age but its significance unmistakable. My pulse quickened as I stepped forward, donning gloves to carefully lift it from the earth. It was heavy, its contents shifting faintly with the motion. "This is it," I said, my voice low. "Let's get it back to the precinct." Under controlled conditions, we opened the box. Inside was a trove of damning evidence: faded bank records, correspondence implicating prominent figures, and documents detailing a sprawling money laundering operation. Among the names were business magnates, politicians, and even law enforcement officials, all tied to Henry Carter's empire. Linda sifted through the papers, her expression grim. "This isn't just about Henry," she said quietly. "This is about everyone who kept his secrets and profited from them." I nodded, my jaw tightening. "And someone out there is still cleaning up after him. They poisoned Helen to keep this buried." The implications were staggering, and the danger was more real than ever. Whoever had targeted Helen wouldn't stop now, not with so much at stake. The race to protect her, and to uncover the full truth, had only just begun. The drive back from the cemetery to the precinct felt heavy, the rusted box resting securely on the seat beside me. Every bump in the road felt like an echo of the weight of what we'd uncovered. The documents inside that box weren't just records, they were the keys to dismantling a web of corruption that had likely ruined countless lives. But with that realization came a chilling thought: whoever had gone to such lengths to keep these secrets buried wouldn't hesitate to go further. Back at the precinct, Detective Linda Hayes wasted no time combing through the contents of the box. Her desk was covered in old financial statements, letters, and photos, each one a puzzle piece pointing to a larger, darker picture. The names leaped off the pages: high-profile individuals with connections to Henry Carter's network. It was a list of power players, politicians, business tycoons, and law enforcement officers who had turned a blind eye or actively participated in the crimes. I stood across from her desk, my arms crossed, my mind racing. "This goes way beyond Henry Carter," I said, the anger bubbling under the surface. "This is systemic. These people didn't just protect him, they thrived because of him." Linda didn't look up, her focus sharp as she flipped through an old ledger. "And they've kept it going," she said, her tone grim. "Even after Henry disappeared, Look at this. She pointed to a series of transactions, each one tied to a shell company that funneled money to offshore accounts. The dates stretched into the present. Proof that the network hadn't just survived, it had evolved. As she spoke, my phone buzzed. It was the hospital. My stomach tightened as I answered. This is Officer Miller. The nurse's voice was calm but firm. Officer, we've had a situation. Helen Carter's condition remains critical. But we've had a security incident. A man was spotted lingering near her room earlier today. When approached by staff, he left quickly. But it was clear he wasn't supposed to be there. My grip on the phone tightened. Did you get a description? Late 40s or early 50s. Tall. Broad shoulders. He was wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. Security tried to follow him. But he disappeared into the parking lot. My heart sank. Gerald Ross. It had to be. His name had surfaced multiple times in the documents, an enforcer in Henry Carter's network. Someone who ensured silence through intimidation or worse. And now he was watching Helen. Thank you for letting me know, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll send someone to secure her room immediately. I hung up and looked at Linda. Ross is moving. He was at the hospital. Her pen stopped mid-note. And her expression hardened. We're running out of time. I called for additional officers to secure Helen's hospital room and ensure no one could get near her without clearance. But even as I did, a nagging thought crept into my mind. If Ross was this desperate, what else might he be planning? He'd been operating in the shadows for years. And now the spotlight was closing in. Later that evening, I drove back to the hospital myself. I couldn't just sit at the precinct while Helen lay vulnerable. As I parked and walked toward the entrance, the air felt heavier, charged with unease. The corridors of Mercy General were quiet, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the tiled floors. When I stepped into Helen's room, she was asleep. The oxygen mask still covered her face, and the beeping monitors were a steady reminder of how fragile her condition was. I pulled up a chair beside her bed, the sight of her frail form stirring something deeply protective within me. You've been through so much, I murmured softly, though I knew she couldn't hear me. But I promise you, Helen, we're going to make this right. You've carried this weight for too long, and it's time for someone else to take it. Her fingers twitched slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might wake, but she remained still. Her breathing shallow but steady. As I sat there, the pieces of the case swirled in my mind. The documents, the journal, the names, the poisoned tea, it all pointed to a vast conspiracy. One that someone was willing to kill to protect. I left the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about bringing down Gerald Ross or exposing the network Henry Carter had built. It was about justice for Helen, a woman who had lived in fear for decades and had finally decided to speak up. She had risked everything to do the right thing. And I wasn't about to let her down. Driving back through the quiet streets of Maplewood, I couldn't help but notice how deceptive the town's serenity felt now. Beneath its surface lay secrets that had festered for decades. And I knew we were only beginning to uncover the full extent of it. But one thing was certain. Helen Carter's courage had sparked something. And there was no turning back. We were in the fight now. And the truth was finally within reach. The following morning, the precinct buzzed with tension. The evidence from the box had sent shockwaves through our team. And Detective Linda Hayes was already deep into connecting the dots. The web of corruption was vast. And the more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Gerald Ross wasn't just an enforcer, he was central to keeping Henry Carter's empire alive long after his disappearance. But as we worked to unravel the mystery, the pressure grew. Ross and his associates weren't going to sit idly by while their secrets came to light. I grabbed a coffee and headed into Linda's office, where she sat surrounded by stacks of papers and her laptop screen glowing with financial records. You look like you haven't slept, I said, half joking, though her tired eyes told me she hadn't. I haven't, she replied, not looking up. And I won't until we nail these bastards. I leaned over her desk, scanning the names on the screen. They were powerful people, bankers, developers, even a retired senator, all tied to Henry Carter's illegal dealings. It's incredible they've stayed hidden this long. I muttered. They had help, Linda said sharply, tapping on a name. Look at this. Gerald Ross didn't just enforce loyalty, he managed the whole operation after Henry disappeared. He's been the gatekeeper, keeping the money flowing and ensuring anyone who got too close stayed quiet. The thought made my stomach turn. Helen Carter had lived in fear for decades because of men like Ross. But the more we dug, the closer we got to breaking their grip on Maplewood. Then came the call that changed everything. One of our undercover officers, stationed outside Mercy General, reported seeing a suspicious black SUV lingering near the hospital's parking lot. The vehicle matched the description of the car Ross had been seen driving, and my heart raced as I grabbed my radio. Stay on him. But don't engage until we get backup, I ordered. Already heading for my patrol car. Minutes later, I was speeding toward the hospital, adrenaline surging through my veins. This was our chance to catch Ross before he could make his next move. As I approached the parking lot, the SUV peeled out, tires screeching as it sped down the street. I slammed on the gas, my sirens wailing as I gave chase. The pursuit took us through the quiet streets of Maplewood, where early risers paused to watch the flashing lights race past. Ross's driving was reckless, weaving dangerously between cars and cutting sharp turns. He knew the area well, and it was clear he wasn't going to make this easy. Dispatch. This is Officer Miller, I said into the radio, keeping my focus on the speeding SUV. I'm in pursuit of a black SUV heading south on Maplewood Avenue, requesting immediate backup. The chase continued for what felt like an eternity, though it was only minutes. Ross turned onto a narrow side street, his tires kicking up gravel as he tried to lose me. I followed closely, my heart pounding with a mix of determination and fear. But as we approached a busy intersection, he made a sharp turn into an alley too narrow for my patrol car. I slammed the brakes, frustration boiling over as I watched the SUV disappear into the distance. Suspect lost near 4th and Oak. I radioed, my voice tight, requesting units to sweep the area. As I stepped out of my car to inspect the alley, I noticed fresh tire marks, proof Ross had been here. I clenched my fists, the sting of his escape sharp. He was still out there, watching, waiting, and now, more desperate than ever. Back at the precinct, Linda was waiting when I returned, her face etched with concern. Let me guess, she said. Ross got away. I nodded, the frustration still simmering. He's smart. Too smart. But we've got him cornered. He knows it. And that makes him dangerous. Linda leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she tapped a pen against her desk. If he's getting this bold, it means we're getting close. The question is, what's his next move? Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. We both knew the answer. Ross wouldn't stop until he'd eliminated the threat Helen posed and anyone else who got in his way. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the chase, the documents in the box, and Helen's frail form in the hospital bed. I couldn't shake the image of her whispering, "They'll find me." She had faced her fears to expose the truth, and now it was up to us to protect her and finish what she'd started. As dawn broke over Maplewood, I made a silent promise. Ross's time was running out, and I'd do whatever it took to ensure Helen Carter's courage wasn't in vain. The morning sun cast a golden hue over Maplewood, but the weight of the previous day's events pressed heavily on my shoulders. Gerald Ross was out there, a predator lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance to strike. As I parked my car outside the precinct, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about bringing down a criminal network anymore, it was about protecting Helen Carter, a woman who had endured more than anyone should, and ensuring justice for the secrets she'd carried for decades. Detective Linda Hayes was already at her desk. Her sleeves rolled up and her face set in fierce concentration. She had spent the night piecing together the timeline of Ross's activities, connecting dots between the documents we'd recovered and incidents that had long been swept under the rug. Her desk was covered in notes and photographs, and in the center of it all was Helen's journal. Its pages open to a particularly chilling entry. "I found it," Linda said without looking up. "The piece that ties everything together." I stepped closer, scanning the lines of text she had underlined. The entry was dated years ago, but its significance was clear. Henry never disappeared. They made him disappear. If they find out I know, they'll come for me too. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. They didn't just silence Henry, I said, my voice low. They've been keeping Helen quiet ever since. Linda nodded, her jaw tight. And now that she's spoken up, they're scrambling. Ross isn't just trying to cover his tracks, he's trying to finish what they started. We didn't have much time. Linda and I devised a plan to force Ross out of hiding, using the documents from the box as bait. We would stage a transport operation, leaking false information that the evidence was being moved to a secure facility across town. It was a risky strategy, but it was our best chance to draw him out. By evening, everything was in place. An unmarked van sat in the precinct parking lot. 2 undercover officers posing as transport personnel inside. Linda and I would follow closely in separate vehicles, with surveillance teams stationed along the route. The plan hinged on Ross taking the bait, and the tension in the air was palpable as we prepared to move. "Do you think he'll go for it?" Linda asked as we climbed into our cars. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. He doesn't have a choice. He knows what's at stake. The convoy began its journey through the dimly lit streets of Maplewood, the quiet hum of the van's engine barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Every shadow felt alive, every corner a potential ambush. As we approached the outskirts of town, the black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror, its headlights glaring like predatory eyes. "He's here," I said into the radio, my voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "Stay on course. Wait for my signal." The SUV made its move near a deserted stretch of road, swerving aggressively to force the van to a stop. 2 more vehicles joined in, boxing the van in on all sides. Ross stepped out of the SUV, flanked by 3 men, his weapon drawn as he barked orders at the undercover officers. "Move in," I commanded, the words ringing out like a starting pistol. In a coordinated assault, patrol cars and tactical units swarmed the scene. Sirens wailed, floodlights illuminated the darkness, and officers surrounded the SUVs. Ross froze for a split second, his arrogance faltering as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. He raised his weapon, but I fired a warning shot, the crack of the gun echoing in the night. "Don't make me do this, Ross," I said, my voice firm. His jaw tightened, his face twisting with fury, but he dropped his weapon. "You think this is over?" he spat as officers moved in to handcuff him. "You have no idea what you're up against." The rest of his crew surrendered without resistance, and as they were loaded into patrol cars, I felt a wave of relief mixed with unease. Ross's words lingered in my mind, a chilling reminder that this fight wasn't over yet. Linda approached as the scene quieted, her expression resolute. "We've got them. But he's right about one thing," she said. "This is bigger than we thought." I nodded, the weight of the night settling over me. "Then we don't stop here. We take down everyone involved." As we drove back to the precinct with Ross in custody, the streets of Maplewood felt quieter than usual. But for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. Helen Carter's bravery had set this chain of events in motion. And now, with Ross behind bars, we were one step closer to ensuring her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. As the dust settled over Maplewood, a sense of justice began to take root. Gerald Ross and his associates were behind bars, and the tangled web of corruption they had upheld for decades was finally exposed. Helen Carter, though still frail, found peace knowing her courage had not been in vain. Her bravery had sparked a reckoning, ensuring that those who had thrived on fear and manipulation would finally face the consequences. In her quiet home, Helen tended to her garden, each bloom a symbol of resilience and renewal. Officer James Miller often visited, their bond forged through adversity and shared determination. Together, they reflected on the lessons learned that truth and justice, though sometimes buried, could rise again with unwavering courage. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of resilience, courage, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit.